All right, welcome everyone. I'm so excited to kick off a presentation this afternoon. And in this presentation and conversation, we're going to introduce you to the Forests and Cities Network and really talk about urban natural areas as a climate solution and talk about sort of the process of calculating the amount of carbon stored and sequestered in urban natural areas and forests across 6 US cities. So just to introduce myself, my name is Sophie Plitt. I work as the National Partnerships Manager with the Natural Areas Conservancy. And I'll hand it over to my co-presenter, Clara.
Hi, everyone. My name is Clara Pregitzer, and I'm the Deputy Director of Conservation at the Natural Areas Conservancy.
And today we're also joined by 3 panelists from our member cities, Ashley Bowers from the city of Baltimore, Spencer Gale from the city of Indianapolis, and Lisa Seco from Seattle. Before we begin, I just want to say that this webinar was made possible by funding from Con Edison, and much of the work we'll be presenting today was funded by the J.M. Kaplan Foundation, J.M. Kaplan Fund, and the JPB Foundation. And we also received oversight from the Yale School of Forestry. And we'd really like to thank our partners listed here who contributed to this study that we'll discuss today. So first of all, I'd like to orient you to the Forests and Cities Network. This network was launched by the Natural Areas Conservancy in 2019 to promote and advance healthy forested natural areas and cities across America through science, management, partnership, and communications. It's composed of expert teams of forest practitioners and advocates from across 12 metro regions here on the map across the whole United States. Can go to the next slide. Our network has 3 goals. The first is to nurture and grow a national network of experts. The second is to advance urban forest science and practice. And the third is to advocate for increased resources and support. And this is all to support the conservation and management of healthy forests and the many benefits they provide to urban residents. And I just wanted to mention that this week, our network is actually having our annual gathering. Normally we would have this in person, but this week it's virtual. And we've been using this time together to network, share new knowledge, and discuss strategies for national advocacy. And many of our network members are currently attending their webinar, and even some of their invited professional networks as well. So we welcome all of those folks to the webinar. And for the rest of you, we're so excited to introduce you to this network and some of the work we do. And speaking of some of the work we do, just to highlight sort of some of the collective accomplishments of this network, we published a report called Untapped Common Ground, which really highlighted management of forests across 125 organizations in 111 cities, and really gives an idea of how these forests are being protected and managed across the entire US. We also hosted an in-person convening for the first time in 2019, along with our network and partners. We've collectively published a special issue of the journal Cities and the Environment, highlighting 25 unique case studies about urban forested natural areas science and management. And those were authored by our network members and Natural Areas Conservancy staff. Together, we've also published earned media and communications and blog posts together. And then most recently, we've conducted a study about how COVID-19 impacted our partner cities and learned about how it's affected their staffing, budget, and ability to care for natural areas. Most recently, we've launched an online resource library, which is built for and by our network members to share case studies, fact sheets, protocols, and other knowledge amongst our network and beyond.
Thanks, Sophie. So I'll walk you through an agenda. So for the first 20 to 30 minutes of this hour, I will introduce you to climate change in cities and the role that urban forests play, and also debut some exciting new work from looking at carbon accounting from cities in this network. I'm going to try to leave as much time as possible for questions. So please introduce yourself in the chat, say where you're listening in from, and we'll have time to talk to Lisa, Ashley, and Spencer at the end of this presentation. So climate change is here. This should not come as a shock to most people. Our climate is changing, and we as people are experiencing these impacts along with all life on Earth. The summer of 2021 was both one of the hottest and wettest on record. The recent IPCC report came out in early August, Chapter 1, and we know that humans have caused these changes. It's a message that hasn't changed much since the first IPCC report in 1990. We've seen a global mean surface air temperature increase from 1 degree, and this has caused warmer oceans and a climatic shift that has resulted in changes in weather that we all experience. Heat waves and precipitation events have been extreme on the East Coast and on the West Coast in a lot of the network cities that we work with. And so to call out some of these patterns in the cities that we've worked with, I've highlighted some of the impacts of climate change and how they've impacted some of our partner cities. So here in New York City, where I'm calling in from, just in the last 2 months, we've had Hurricane Henri, Hurricane Ida in the last 10 years, including Sandy and Irene. The city of Austin had power outages in a winter storm in 2021. More frequent and intense hurricanes have been seen in Miami and Tampa, and the flooding during Hurricane Harvey in Houston caused extreme damage. And this summer on the West Coast, temperatures were maxing out above 110. So cities are definitely facing the consequences of climate change, and all of the people that live in cities are experiencing those. But we know that nature can be part of the solution. Natural climate solutions is a term that is now used to describe better stewardship of land in order to mitigate and address the negative outcomes of climate change. Recent research has shown that natural climate solutions could provide over 1/3 of the cost-effective climate mitigation needed between now and 2030 to stabilize warming below 2%. And of course, this is alongside aggressive fossil fuel reduction. So this includes protecting forests, protecting wetlands and grasslands, but also management of existing forests, wetlands, and grasslands, and then restoration of forests and land that are in need of care. So what role can cities play, kind of considering how much natural land is outside of cities? So I think it's important to recognize that cities can be a major contributor of climate change impacts. So rapid land use conversion and urbanization is contributing to the problem of climate change. So just protecting forest land is an important part of a natural climate solution. Cities also consume the majority of the world's energy and produce the majority of greenhouse gases. And this isn't surprising because of how many people live in cities. But cities can also be a really important part of the solution. So thinking about how many people live in cities, just in our 12-city network, 64 million people live in these cities. And so we have the opportunity to really provide examples and initiate novel opportunities to manage land in cities and consider how much our cities could contribute to battling local emissions and local improving quality of life, such as reducing temperatures. And so we know that urban forests are part of the solution. And so that's been known. Planting trees in cities is something that makes life better, can provide cooling, and also improve community. But not all urban trees are the same. And so we know that forested natural areas are different than landscaped park trees, yard trees, and street trees. So what are forested natural areas? These are places that really look and feel like the woods. So here are some examples. Here's a forest in Seattle, Indianapolis, Jacksonville, Florida, Minneapolis. And so these are some of the beautiful forests that exist in our 12-city network. So our research has really shown over the past few years and suggested that natural areas could play an important role as climate solutions, but they really have not been quantified or well described. Recent research done by our organization in combination with our partners has found that natural areas could account for 68% of parkland in the 100 most populous cities. This is over 700,000 acres. And this really came as a surprise. I often think in city parks, we might think of really landscaped parks, but finding out that natural areas are a majority of parkland came as a surprise. But they're really threatened. So we also found that land use change is really common in natural areas. So just in 5 years, between 2014 and 2019, we saw a 4% decline in natural area parkland in the 100 largest cities. So that's almost 40,000 acres that was converted to a different land use type. And in some cases, this was extreme. I think the city of Nashville lost 8,000 acres of natural area in 5 years. We also found from a national survey that a lack of awareness of natural areas was very common. The organizations that manage natural areas cited 70% of the time that outside of their own organization, people are often not aware of the value and the benefits that natural areas face. There's also ecological challenges. Invasive species are very common in cities. And that's one of the top management activities that organizations working in natural areas conduct, invasive species removal. And we know that invasive species can threaten the future health of the forest. We also know that limited data is a challenge. And so across over 100 organizations, we found that 90% listed limited data, including a lack of climate change projection data and a lack of maps of natural areas being key challenges. So with all of this, we really thought that there could be potential that natural areas could play an important role, but maybe we're not well recognized or not well understood. And we in New York City had done some preliminary work and found some surprising facts in New York City and wanted to see if this pattern held true in other cities. So we really asked, what role can natural areas play as a climate solution? And we specifically focused on carbon because that was something we could easily calculate. Easily, I say with a grain of salt, but we were able to calculate it with existing data on vegetation that some cities had. So before I dive into talking about carbon storage and sequestration, I wanted to just give a very high level overview of what carbon is. So carbon is an element found in most every living thing, humans, plants, animals, and about 50% of the biomass in trees is carbon. And when living things die, they produce CO2, which is considered an emission. And CO2 is a type of greenhouse gas along with methane. And when fossil fuels are burned, when wood is burned, they all produce CO2. So when a wildfire is burning, that's producing a lot of CO2. So this accounting of CO2 in the atmosphere, and when trees take in CO2 and release oxygen, that's called sequestration. And then they convert that into carbon that helps them grow. I just lost my advancement. I'll also just maybe comment here on this figure. So you can see sort of, this is a breakdown of sort of where carbon is in the forest system. And so most of the carbon is stored in trees and in soil. So you can see in a forest ecosystem, about 40% is in the trunk and branches and about 45% in the soil organic matter. So we were able to look at this and think about this in forested natural areas in 6 cities. So we leveraged the expertise and work of our Forest and Cities Network and really collaborated with 6 cities, 5 cities, and then we had data for New York City. So 6 cities that had data on the tree species, tree size, and then we've worked with the cities to collect soil in some cases. And I'll also highlight that the city of Indianapolis went out and actually collected data for 2 weeks this past summer to be included in the study. So I was super impressed to see that data collection effort. And these are 2 pictures from a forested natural area in Indianapolis. And so essentially, I'll really kind of skim over the methods of how we did this, but we collected forest plots or used existing forest plots from these 6 cities and then ran them through a bunch of equations. And I want to highlight and call out Crystal Crown, my colleague who did a lot of the math for this, and kind of produced an estimate for trees. And so we'll have soils and downwoody material as well included in the budget, but this is preliminary. And so we're really focused, we're really just showing the preliminary data for trees today. All right, so let's see what we found. So across 6 cities, the average rate of carbon stored in natural areas is similar. And so I'll walk you through this figure. You'll see the cities at the bottom. The green dots are just individual forest plots that were measured. So there's a lot of variation in sort of how many plots there are in each city, and that was just existing data that it includes the fact that there was existing data, but also sort of different sizes and different scopes included. But the red dot shows the average of carbon storage across these 6 cities. And so one thing to sort of highlight here is that it's actually pretty similar across these 3 or these 6 cities, which I think is really interesting to see that that, you know, even though there's huge geographic differences between these cities, that there's relatively the same amount of carbon being stored. And so there are some differences. So St. Louis, their data is really for one individual park, Forest Park, where they have really robust monitoring data and established plots. But that's really different than New York City and Seattle, who have, you know, citywide data. And so there's a lot more plots there. So to put some of this in context, since we've had a little bit more time to look at the data in New York City, we can begin to think about what this might mean or what we might be able to compare. So in New York City, we found that in forested natural areas within the city, compared to a rural forest, there's actually roughly the same, but even a little bit more carbon stored per acre or per hectare. And I think this is maybe an artifact of a few different things. So it could be that we have warmer temperatures due to the urban heat island effect. So we might have higher growth rates and larger trees, but also just tree preservation. And then also some of our natural areas, I think, were previously landscaped. And so they might have really big stately trees in them, which contributes to an increase in carbon storage. But another thing you'll find is there's a lot of variation in cities. And so looking at these green dots, each of those is a forest stand. And so you can see that this really ranges from down below where there's, you know, close to 0 carbon stored in some places, to all the way up to, you know, nearing 1,000 megagrams per hectare. And so what could be contributing to some of this variation? And so this really is all about the size, arrangement, and species of trees in our natural areas. So if you see here in carbon is really, you know, coming from biomass. So if you have a lot of large trees, really high density, that will increase your carbon storage. And so in our native dominated mature forests in New York City, we found those stored the most carbon, and our invasive open areas or vinelands stored the least amount of carbon. And then there's a lot of variation in between here. And I think when we looked at this and separated it by city, we saw some similar patterns, but we have more to dig in on. So if you think about the different forest types and the biomes that we're looking at, Seattle might have Douglas fir, western red cedar, and this high category where they're storing a lot of carbon. And then maybe an early open successional forest that's storing less carbon. But invasive species, kind of highlighting one of the themes I brought up before about invasive species and sort of the challenge that cities are facing in our natural areas. Invasive species are definitely playing a role in the forest trajectory. And so this is just to call out 2 sites so you can get a visual picture. This is a site that has only 11 megagrams of carbon per hectare, which is an invasive shrubland. And so this is a site that might have, you know, not a lot of biodiversity, a site that might not have, obviously as many ecosystem services, especially carbon, compared to our oak tulip tree forests, which are native here, which in this particular site is storing 415 megagrams of carbon per hectare. And so this really is to just show an example of why manipulating vegetation within natural areas could play an important role in the ecosystem benefits, specifically carbon, that they could provide. So another major factor that contributes to the total amount of carbon that can be stored in cities is the size and spatial arrangement of cities. And so while we found that there was sort of a similar range in carbon per hectare, when we attempted to scale this to acres, just the total size of the city and the acres of natural areas made a really big difference. And so I wanted to show this first before I show the next figure, which shows a preliminary look at scaling the carbon per hectare to the total amount of hectares within each of natural areas within each of these cities. And wanted to just highlight that, New York City is 302 square miles, Indianapolis is 368 square miles, and then I think Seattle or St. Louis has is the smallest of all and is 65 square miles. And so all of this will contribute when you're doing sort of comparisons between cities. And so this figure shows the total carbon stored in each city. And I really want to reiterate again, this is really just about the amount of acres and sort of the ability to scale. So wanted to just highlight that even though it looks like, Seattle, Baltimore, and St. Louis are storing a lot less carbon, it's really due to just the size of the city and the size of the natural areas. And in St. Louis, I think this is scaled just to one park. And so wanted to just kind of highlight that, because I think even even one park can make a big difference to a localized area. But you can see the differences here. And so across all cities, there's 2 million megagrams of carbon across these 6 cities, and a megagram is equal to a ton if anyone is savvy with that language. So we also have some really preliminary data looking at sequestration. And this is really contingent on a lot of things. So this is really the full potential of sequestration that these forests could have. And again, this is really dictated by the element of scaling. And so please view these as preliminary, but this is sort of to give you a sense of sort of what value do forested natural areas have. And so this is on an annual basis. So how much carbon can be sequestered annually. And so when you add up all of our 6 cities that we did this for, the carbon sequestration offsets almost 80 million gallons of gas in natural areas. And so I put that in there as sort of a point of comparison, but there's calculators out there that I think I got this from the EPA calculator, but you could also look at, miles driven, or even equate this to a dollar value. But I think this really shows the incredible value that forested natural areas potentially have to contribute in mitigation efforts. So a few things I want to highlight. We're going to be looking at soil and down-weighted debris, but it's not just trees that store carbon, but healthy ecosystems. And I think I want to make that point because I think when we think about tree planting in cities, or management or maintenance or land protection, I think all of these are really important strategies for creating more healthy, sustainable, and equitable cities. But I think really taking a look at the ecology and ecosystem of the forests that we have, and viewing them in a multidimensional way will be critical, and all of the different elements that contribute to healthy ecosystems. So even when we've done this carbon accounting across all of these different elements in the ecosystem, the trees in the soil sequester carbon, but once a tree dies, it starts emitting carbon. And so all of this is sort of part of a cycle. And I think we really need to be considering healthy forest management and the trajectory of forests in this cycle if we're really serious about mitigation and increasing carbon storage in cities. And also wanted to highlight that since we're just showing the trees, if all the other pools are included, the total carbon stored more than doubles. So could view that 80 million gallons of gas as you know, just the trees, and that could that will increase when we include these other elements. So I have a few takeaways and considerations, and then we can move into discussion. So my first takeaway is that natural areas could have a disproportionately high ecosystem benefit compared to other tree canopy types. So if we're looking at sort of a unit of tree canopy to a unit of tree canopy, a natural area will likely have a higher carbon storage than another tree canopy type. And when we looked in New York City, we found that natural areas store 69% of the total carbon stored in New York City and sequester 83%. We haven't done this comparison in other cities, and we're kind of investigating if that's possible. But in New York City, they're just 25% of the tree canopy. So even though they're a minority of the tree canopy, they're storing and sequestering most of the carbon. My second takeaway is that forest management is really needed, and not just tree planting. And so I think thinking about sort of how and where we invest dollars in increasing carbon storage and increasing ecosystem benefits in healthy cities, looking at our forests and where we might have forests that are declining, but with a little bit investment, might follow this path on the top, that with management, a declining forest could become a healthier forest, which would have high carbon storage, as well as many other co-benefits. But without management, we're likely to see a decline in the condition and also the potential for carbon storage. And so really thinking about how can we invest in forest management along with tree planting. And then my third takeaway is that land preservation and resilience management strategies are needed. And so thinking about the fact that we lost 4% of natural area parkland in 5 years in 100 largest cities, and sort of what that benefit really adds up to. And kind of, you know, thinking about how can we add better protections to our healthy mature forests, so maybe they don't get converted to a different land use type, and really viewing them as an ecosystem that can provide many benefits. But also thinking about the impacts of the forests that the forests themselves are experiencing due to climate change. So thinking about storm blowdowns, increased heat and periods of drought, and how can we manage to make our forests more resilient in the future. And a few considerations, additional considerations. I think I want to sort of emphasize that carbon is really only one benefit that we were able to plug into some calculations now, but not all ecosystems should be managed to increase carbon storage. And so in New York City, we have maritime coastal forests that provide incredible benefits for a variety of benefits, one of them being sort of adjacent to coastal areas. And it's made up of, you know, bayberry species that will never be really large. And so we should definitely not think about kind of converting that into a plantation that could, you know, increase carbon storage. So I want to emphasize that, you know, carbon is one benefit, but it must be looked sort of alongside sort of the full ecosystem benefits. And then second, cities are really still a carbon source. And so cities are still, you know, creating a lot of emissions. And so natural areas should be considered alongside many other strategies, both green and blue strategies. And so thinking about how can we integrate natural areas into city sustainability plans and climate action plans, and having that data and information ready to go. And then I think, you know, kind of along with the sort of singular look at carbon in this presentation, I think really important to sort of note that how can we overlay other goals that we have for our cities, such as equity, such as cooling, and kind of thinking about it in a more dimensional way. So just wanted to acknowledge those considerations. And I think maybe I'll stop there and open it up back over to Sophie and our panelists to have a discussion.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Clara. I might just kick things off with a few quick kind of technical questions on the presentation that came up in the chat. So how are you distinguishing between storing and sequestering carbon?
Great question. So carbon storage is the carbon that's stored in the wood, leaves, soil, and sequestration is sort of the annual rate of carbon storage. So once carbon is stored, that's sort of what the stock is in the forest. And so if you look at your forest, that is years and years of sequestration. But sequestration gives you an annual rate of that takes into consideration how fast the tree is growing, the species, and it gives you sort of the rate of sort of added storage.
Great, thanks. And then a kind of specific question on the slide you showed of the oak tulip forest and the invasive vineland. Were those two areas similar in size?
Yeah, no, there's more, there's definitely more native. So in that picture, it was on a per acre or per hectare basis. So if you look at sort of equal size to equal size, the large mature forests store a lot more carbon, but there also are more native forests than invasive vinelands in New York City, and I think in most all of the cities that are represented here. But vines are a threat. So I think when our forest established here, a lot of our mature oak trees, the invasive vines weren't as big of a threat, and they maybe weren't as robust. But over the last 80 to 100 years, you know, invasive species have been really prolific, more established. The spread has really expanded, and so I think there's a sort of threat there, and we've seen them increasing in size over time, like in the last 20 years. So I think that yeah, but it's not like it's, there's different distributions of all vegetation types across all of these cities.
Great, thank you so much for that response. Now I'm going to ask some questions of our panel. Again, we have 3 representatives of the cities who participated in this 6-city study. Ashley Bowers from Baltimore, Spencer Gale from Indianapolis, and Lisa Seco from Seattle. So the first question I have to pose to the panel is, given the findings that large mature trees store a lot of carbon, what are some of the primary challenges in ensuring continued regeneration and healthy forest trajectories in the natural areas forests in your cities? So maybe I'll see if Ashley would like to respond first.
Sure, Sophie, thanks. Hi, everyone. So one of the major issues, which I think is pertinent in every urban area, but specifically a little differently in Baltimore, is impervious surface. So because of impervious surfaces, within Baltimore, we have extreme stormwater runoff issues. We have a municipal separate storm sewer system. So our storm drains at the street level collect rainwater and directly outfall them into our streams, which are in interior forested landscapes. So the degradation of these streams is resulting in concerns around the need for stream restorations. And in order to access these streams, we're facing a lot of construction activity through our forested natural areas. So impervious surface is kind of an indirect challenge for us, but again, just with climate change and increasing large storm events, the amount of pressure that we're seeing from stormwater runoff is directly affecting our forested natural areas.
Thanks, Ashley. Lisa, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. So in Seattle, our natural area management has focused a lot on transitioning degraded forested parklands from shorter-lived tree species to longer-lived conifer species. And you can kind of picture, even in the picture behind me, but in the Pacific Northwest, we can grow really, really big trees. Think, the 1,000-year-old, 8-foot across Western red cedar. And so our intention is really to gain that carbon sequestration and storage benefit is to focus on conifer species and long-lived species. And that has become, increasingly difficult with climate change. The temperature increases and sustained drought are evident. The impacts of that are really evident in our forested parklands in Seattle. And so thinking about how we make a transition, not just from the deciduous species to conifer, thinking about the seed provenance and really trying to build future healthy forests that can handle some of the climate extremes. And I think, there's a huge and very complicated interplay with site conditions, genetics, newly arriving pests and pathogens that is going to be really difficult to continue to manage for the benefits that we do see. And I think in some ways, the forest in cities have a lot to teach us about kind of how climate change continues to accelerate and what the impacts are going to look like.
Absolutely. Very well put. Spencer, do you have anything to add?
Sure. First of all, I really like the way you asked this question because it talks about regeneration. And I think that's one of the most important things we can do is on the practitioner side is to keep our urban ecosystems regenerative. In Indianapolis, there's a multitude of issues on the ground. We manage about 70 different invasive species across all the different natural areas in Indianapolis. But one, Asian bush honeysuckle, is our ubiquitous understory invasive that's been shown through studies going back 20 years that it reduces survival of canopy and understory trees. It reduces survival of annual and perennial herbs. And we can see it as practitioners and ecologists that it will basically create a 12 to 15 foot ground cover with bare soil underneath it and no regeneration. So that's invasive species is key. We have fire adapted forested ecosystems that do need fire to be healthy and regenerative. We also need to recover quite a bit of forest from ash die-off. So we're working on that and trying not to let the invasives just come in so fast that we're not getting ahead of that. And that's where we're planting more trees and then buffering, more buffering of the mature remnant forest ecosystems. So I think for us, it's, all that gets back down to more data or more funding, and we need more data. And the carbon study is fantastic advocacy piece for a lot of us to use. So I think we need to try to like monetizing the natural area services, trying to get that information in front of decision makers, because ultimately what's needed on the ground requires more funding.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. So the next question is moving a little bit away from carbon, and we're curious, what are some of the other kind of co-benefits or additional benefits aside from carbon storage of healthy forests in your city? And if one of you wants to jump in, feel free.
I can jump in and start. So I think this is the awesome part. There are so many different co-benefits, some that we probably don't even understand yet. And I know across the panel that mental health and well-being benefits have been really obvious, especially in the last year and a half of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's brought people out to parks to gather with family and friends in really new ways to recreate, to take care of themselves. And so I think that's an obvious benefit. And I think it's also true with the type of programming that we lead, really focused on stewardship with the Green Seattle Partnership, that people have been even more eager in the last year and a half to participate and contribute. And I think it's because there's something very, very anchoring about ecological restoration, and tree planting is kind of a most obvious part of that. There's really, it's not just about the wildlife restoration and the the ecological benefits of that, but it is like the rebuilding, restoring of relationships between people and ecosystems. So it's, I think, an important part of our work in cities because of the proximity to community, that there's this chance to like very basically get people out to touch the soil and interact with the land and kind of rebuild that relationship.
Yeah, I would say, very similarly in Baltimore City, having these natural areas in close proximity to our urban communities does create an opportunity for new networks and community within this type of recreational space, which, also provides so many benefits for our, psychological health and well-being. And so not only can you create programming and educational opportunities around these forests, but you can build community in these spaces. We, of course, have other benefits besides the carbon storage and sequestration, like stormwater management. Our natural areas really serve as a green infrastructure, and they already exist here in our cities. So really highlighting this as an existing benefit and infrastructure that we have, and advocating for their preservation because of those benefits. If we have healthy forests that are existing today, maintaining them now before all of these pressures from climate change are degrading them is going to leave us better off if we can really work to preserve them. And in addition to stormwater management, we also have urban heat island reductions in our urban areas as a result of natural areas. So the benefits are really endless, and we really want to continue this conversation and promotion of taking these all into account when we're talking to our neighbors and council people and state delegates about the importance and significance of these spaces for maintaining healthy, resilient cities.
I'll just chime in quickly. I think they said a lot that I'll agree with, and I kind of come to the point of thinking when we advocate for natural areas and cities, that going through the lens of climate change, resiliency, and public health, it seems like those are really strong poles. I love the biodiversity and could talk about that all day long, and that is a great co-benefit, but I don't think it's what we lead with anymore. And really agree with what Ashley said about infrastructure. And I really like the concept of a green infrastructure network across the city that really should be anchored by the natural areas. And too much of our conversation around green infrastructure is really about the built environment and a lot of stormwater BMPs, which are fantastic and part of nature-based solutions. But Portland had a great green plan that came out maybe a decade ago. And I thought in terms of stormwater plans or climate plans, I usually don't feel like natural areas get a full seat at the table in the climate plans. Everybody's so excited about new things and new tree plantings and those statistics. But Portland, I think, over a decade ago, really did put invasive species management in natural areas as like a big cornerstone of their plan. And I do like the idea of thinking of our natural areas as infrastructure. That sounds a little dangerous from like a wilderness ethic, but infrastructure gets funding. Natural areas obviously are struggling. So I like that. I like a lot of the things that Ashley and Lisa said.
I'll just say, I think everyone covered it so well. Yeah, I think, it's fun to talk about a lot of the, numbers and quantitative benefits, but I think the social benefits are equal, if not greater, in cities, and the opportunity to provide sort of a window into what a healthy forest can look like in a city and what that means to support plants, animals, to take a walk in the woods. I think we saw a lot of the same patterns during COVID, as I think everyone on this panel did during, the last 18 months and still. So I think, carbon is one way to look at it, but there's so many other benefits.
Absolutely. Thanks, Clara. I'm gonna bring some questions from the audience into play now. So Lisa, I think this one would be a great one for you to address. Tom Schweiss asked, can you speak to strategies that the organizations use to outreach about urban forests, specifically to communities that have traditionally been left out?
Yeah, be happy to talk about that. And actually, I'd love to highlight some work that we've been doing with an organization. So from the Green Seattle Partnership is in the name, our approach is to work with community-based organizations to lead stewardship efforts, in addition to having crews that are doing more technical work. In particular, there's an organization that we have been working with this last year called ECOS, formerly known as the Environmental Coalition of South Seattle. And I like highlighting this work because they're all awesome people to begin with, but their focus with us has been on engaging immigrant and refugee communities in this work. And for this year in particular, our approach is really twofold. One was to start with a group of community leaders and meet and build friendship, but also meet and hear from folks directly about what stewardship means to these communities and what would be appealing in being involved with stewardship activities in Seattle Parks and Recreation. And then as a second part, hosting an event coming up here in a couple of weeks to do planting and to give away plants as well. And so, having community-based partners who are really well-connected and tuned into what frontline communities are interested in contributing and interested in learning is really critical. I would also like to just tag on and add, though, that part of that work comes with thinking about my role as a government agency, the broader history of exclusion from the land, and even just in our practices, who has been excluded in supporting the work that we do through other ways of knowing. So I think it's not just about who you're inviting to the work and who you're offering to plant a tree, but it's also about really reflecting about the systemic racism that exists in natural area networks as well.
Thanks, Lisa. Would anybody else like to add something?
I mean, I'll say, for Baltimore City downtown aside, we really have significant forested natural areas in almost every corner of Baltimore City. So our work for preservation of these forested lands is really in an effort to ensure that ecosystem services provided by natural areas are, distributed all across the city, and that all of our communities have access to these spaces. So in that sense, we're just the existence of our program in an urban center, we're really working to ensure that our city is healthy and resilient for all communities in Baltimore. I think the engagement piece and inviting all communities to utilize the spaces looks a little different than just the general, services that the forest they provide. And our program, we're working with council people to organize stewardship events where they're doing outreach to their communities to engage, their community contacts, but also, we're doing just fun events like hikes through our forests, and creating a safe space where we're all there together to explore a new area. So there's interesting engagement opportunities that we're trying to create as well.
I can chime in just real quick, Sophie. In Indianapolis, the bigger forested blocks are on the outskirts of the city. So one thing that land stewardship does is just kind of reprioritizes itself to work on some of these smaller inner city parks with smaller tracts of forest. From a conservation standpoint, that might not be as much of a priority, but as an equity standpoint, it is. So we redirect and try to take care of those areas. And in our land acquisition planning, we've got 5 major areas, and we're focusing primarily on the area that could affect disadvantaged populations the most. And then finally, we did start minority internship program to do stewardship work with Groundworks Indy and a couple other nonprofits in Indy. And that's been really unique and somewhat challenging program, but we've been able to get a lot of inner city disadvantaged youth out to natural areas, out to do this kind of work and see if it's a good fit for them. So we're doing a few things to go in that direction.
I'll chime in really quickly. I feel like there's a lot that I can learn about this topic and sort of how I feel like I'm already learning a lot from everyone in the network. But I wanted to just say, I think the Natural Areas Conservancy this year released their strategic trails plan, which is really focused on improving public access in natural areas. And I think this is really important for reaching people all across the city in different communities, because I think feeling safe in the woods and feeling like you know where you're going and you have a map and you can easily sort of find your way and navigate is probably, you know, one of the maybe, you know, some of the first ways people can experience or enjoy nature. And so definitely not the only way, but yeah, I just wanted to highlight that's some work that we've been doing. And then have also been hosting an internship for college students from diverse backgrounds and getting experience doing field work in the city. I think it's something that a lot of colleges might, especially colleges that are centered in cities, although I would say Seattle might be an exception given they have a really well-known forestry school in their university, but sort of how natural resources are sort of viewed as, you know, land grant institutions and ways that colleges can really embrace natural resources within the city and not sort of view urban forestry as just tree pruning and tree planting, but really kind of through urban natural areas management. So, yeah.
One of the goals of our program was just to try to just introduce more green job possibilities to disadvantaged youth in Indianapolis, that there is more funding for this. There's a lot of funding for the built green infrastructure environment. We're also doing training on that as well, but just trying to open up career pathways for people as well.
Great, thanks so much for those responses. I wish we had more time, but I'm unable to answer every question we got, and I'm gonna wrap up with a final question. You know, tonight's event is titled The Power of Collaboration, and we are in the midst of our annual meeting, sadly virtual, but happy to be gathering with our national network of forested area practitioners on Zoom this week. So I just wanted to ask y'all if you could reflect a little bit on maybe what one of the benefits of participating in the network or leveraging our collective knowledge has been over the past 2 years for you.
Jump in first again. Or Ashley, if you're ready to go, feel free.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Okay. Yeah, no, I have really appreciated the opportunity to be part of the network. I think in some ways, I've always looked at the work that I do as being some part arboriculture, some part horticulture, and some part ecology. And in that way, there are few other folks within, especially within the city agencies that have similar, kind of a similar body of work. So being able to connect with folks across the country who are like doing the exact same thing has felt really powerful and inspiring. And there's so much to learn from the work that's being accomplished in other cities. So I've definitely appreciated the opportunity.
And I'll say, you know, I think many of us know that, you know, our other city partners are out there doing similar work, but it's a good reminder to know that we're all out there and to, you know, actually have the ability to meet one another through this network has been empowering and and just refreshing to be able to kind of connect with folks who we hadn't really had a good platform to meet or discuss ideas or share accomplishments or challenges that we're facing. So it has really opened up the doors for us to be able to kind of learn and grow from one another. And also, I'll say on a local level, you know, we're part of the network through teams within our cities. So, you know, I've been collaborating with the partners on my Baltimore team, and, you know, we don't necessarily have the time to always get together and discuss our ongoing activities, even within our own city. So that has also, you know, strengthened our relationship on a very local level as well, which has been wonderful.
I definitely echo several things they said. I think sometimes this work can be a little frustrating, and sometimes you can feel like you're not going to be as important as the transportation division in the city. But just knowing that there's others out there working really hard on these challenges, and then sharing the research, being able to build a network of people you can rely on. And I know doing the carbon study with Natural Areas Conservancy was just great. It's put, I think, a lot of energy into land stewardship. And also there's a lot of good talking points that we've been able to use for outreach and things that have helped us a lot. So kind of been waiting for a national group to advocate for urban natural areas. So you guys fit the bill, and we appreciate to be part of your team.
Well, it's so wonderful to hear those reflections. And thank you again to our amazing panelists, Ashley, Spencer, and Lisa. And thank you, Clara, for all the work you've done. And also a special thank you to our colleague, Crystal Crown, who has worked a lot on doing the data collection, cleaning, and analysis to make this all possible. So with that, I'll hand it back to Clara for just a moment, but thank you again for joining our webinar tonight. And thank you to Con Edison for the funding to host it. And we really appreciate you all joining.
Thanks, Sophie. I don't have a lot to add. I just wanted to say thank you again to our panelists and to everyone that joined. And yeah, I've found it, I think, reflecting on sort of Sophie's last question, I think really powerful to sort of hear voices and stories from other cities. And I think being in New York City, I think sometimes it can feel like, oh, New York City is so different than other cities. And, you know, it's different in size, different in sort of governance structure. But I think sort of finding sort of common sort of friends that are working in that space and sort of trying to sort of align some of the challenges that we've all been facing into a more powerful message, I think will be kind of critically important to thinking about the future of our cities, climate change, equity. So yeah, just wanted to say thank you to everyone that's been part of the workshop and to everyone else that joined. And please reach out. My email is on the website, and if you'd like to be connected to any of the panelists, we could also do that, Sophie or I. So have a good evening. Thank you, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Thank you, Sophie and Clara.